Hello, listeners, and welcome to Fighting Failure, the podcast where we discuss solutions to the climate crisis. This is episode 17, all about biofuels. I'm your host for this episode, Oscar Archibald.
I'm your co-host, Hisham Kanan.
And I'm your other co-host, Sunday Stapleton.
It feels good to be hosting again, and welcome back to season 2 of Fighting Failure. And in this season, we're going to be talking all about the built world and the effects on the environment of that. So the season is called House of Cards. I think it's quite a fitting name because it's like a house. So we're talking about energy, waste, urban expansion, not in that order. So it's sort of about the built environment, but it's also, a house of cards is very fragile, as I found when I tried to build one. I think I managed to get about 4 cards into the house. No, 5 cards. I built 2 structures and then 1 on top. Fair to say, it was not my most successful venture. So House of Cards is very fragile, and that is sort of reflecting the state we are in right now with the climate crisis. So biofuels is a sort of thing that not many people know about. So I've got sort of a nice detailed intro to tell you guys what it is and why it's a problem. So biofuels are oft heralded as the bringers of a new era in green energy, but really they're just an excuse to keep using internal combustion engines. So biofuels are sort of a replacement for fossil fuel-based fuels that, rather than being compacted by millions of years under the ground, they're made by using stuff that we grow today, mainly corn. So in the USA, bioethanol generally makes up 10% of the gasoline in cars. So if you go to fill up in the US, you're probably using E10 petrol, which is 10% bioethanol and 90% gasoline. Norway has introduced regulation requiring airlines to make 0.5% of their fuel biofuels, but even this is estimated to cost millions and millions in extra fuel costs because biofuels do tend to be more expensive at the moment than fossil fuels. So how do biofuels work? Corn is used as a feedstock for yeast, and the yeast respire anaerobically to produce ethanol. So hopefully you've done sort of GCSE biology or equivalent. There's aerobic and anaerobic respiration, and when yeast respire anaerobically, they produce ethanol, and ethanol is this sort of fossil fuel-like fuel that can be burned in a normal internal combustion engine, generally without much change to the engine being required. So again, you can just keep using normal engines, and that is the purported advantage of it. And so generally you use corn to provide the sort of starches and sugars for the yeast to digest into the ethanol. And so here's a quote: "The composition of ethanol is different to that of a crude oil-based fossil fuel such as petrol. Higher blends of ethanol can cause corrosion of some rubbers and alloys used in the engine and fuel systems of some older vehicles. But nowadays, because of the standards that require sort of about 10% to 5 to 15% ethanol for fuel mixtures, it does mean that most cars these days are perfectly capable of burning something with a blend of ethanol in it." And for example, nowadays, the UK is also introducing the E10 petrol, 10% bioethanol, and this is supposed to reduce emissions by a huge amount, but it doesn't really, because, as we'll explain later, and it's better than petrol because it has small emissions, but it's not great. But it's much better to use green energy powered EVs, or even not green energy powered EVs, because people always tell me, EVs, but what if they're using dirty energy? And while they might be using dirty energy now, they allow for it to become more green if you shift the energy source. You don't need to change the EV for it to run on green energy compared to fossil fuel energy. So e-fuels are something that's sort of similar but different. So e-fuels use renewable energy. It doesn't have to be renewable energy, but that's sort of the way that it becomes sustainable, to make hydrogen. And then they combine this with carbon dioxide to make replacements for fossil fuels, which are sort of the exact same thing. So they're more synthetic than biofuels, as they're manufactured from their basic elements to form so-called drop-in hydrocarbons, but they are much more expensive. So
you mentioned how e-fuels are generally, better than petrol, even though they are not, the ideal solution. And you mentioned that it's better than petrol because it's slightly greener. It's a slightly greener fuel, but it's also, you don't have to go through the whole process of mining for coal, for oil, of drilling for oil. For e-fuels, it's a much easier process, and it's much less detrimental to the surrounding environment. It's just still not the ideal solution. So it is just one more kind of it's one step forward from petrol, but it's kind of one step back from where we should be and where we could be.
So I think there is important distinction to be made between e-fuels, which are purely synthetic and made by using renewable energy to combine hydrogen and carbon dioxide, and biofuels, which are made by generally growing a crop such as corn, which of course can have, as we discussed in the agriculture section way back in season 1, can have detrimental effects on the environment as well. But it is not sort of, it's all made, for example, within the US, their biofuels would generally come from the US, they sort of corn-based biofuels. And I think the corn lobby does want to keep it that way. There isn't this sort of almost colonialism for oil that we've seen in the past, with big rich nations exploiting poorer nations' oil supplies and these sort of skirmishes over oil fields, because it is just something that you can grow locally. Anyway, anyone want any clarifications about how this works? Have I explained it badly, or are we good to move on?
I think we're pretty good to move on.
Great. So, the problems with biofuels. And the biggest problem is that they are hugely inefficient. So theoretically, biofuels are carbon neutral because the plant which you grow, so we're just going to use corn as an example. So you grow corn, and as the corn grows, it sequesters carbon to create its own biomass. So plants are mainly made out of carbon, and that is carbon that they suck out of the air. And then you turn this corn into ethanol, and then the car burns the ethanol, which puts the carbon back into the atmosphere. But then the next generation of bioethanol plants, or the next generation of corn, will resequester that carbon in a beautiful energy neutral cycle. Unfortunately, it's not. It is actually an energy negative process, which means that we put in more energy than we get out. So it's actually just kind of ridiculous because it requires much more energy and it just doesn't really work.
So about 8.8% of U.S. farmland is used to grow corn for ethanol. And I'm assuming that a large majority of this is grown unsustainably, if not all of it, just kind of knowing the agriculture system in the US and the agriculture system worldwide. And like we discussed in season 1, in the agriculture section, which is section 2 of season 1, agriculture can be a hugely detrimental factor to the environment. And so if things are grown unsustainably using methods such as tillage, pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, such as like ammonia fertilizers, it can be one of the most detrimental things to the environment. So definitely, if you haven't listened to the agriculture section from season 1 yet, go back and listen to that. But again, the agriculture being used to obtain the ethanol for biofuels is probably also not that sustainable. So aside from like not sequestering any carbon in the way that it's kind of made out to do, it's also probably putting off carbon by degrading the soil and kind of harming our ecosystems.
Yeah, the ethanol sort of corn lobby is asking the Biden administration as a supposed climate measure to make gasoline 20% ethanol. So this would mean that at the current sort of, if you just extrapolate, 17.6% of US farmland would be used to grow corn for ethanol, which, as we've discussed, is very energy inefficient.
Oscar, just a quick question. You have like exponents at the end of the percentages?
Yeah, it's sources. If you scroll to the bottom of the document, there's sources for all the statistics I've quoted. Yeah, so if you doubt any of these statistics, I have got sources, and if the sources turn out to be false, drop us an email. Links in the show notes. So photosynthesis is generally less than 1% efficient for extracting energy from the sun, because this is just how photosynthesis works. It's how plants are, is that they're not really that efficient. And that's not really a problem for plants, but to use plants for energy, you can see how this is not a great idea. And this is even worse when you turn up to use corn. It's only 0.25% efficient at extracting energy from the sun, which is just ridiculous. For comparison, solar panels are 12 to 20% efficient at extracting energy from the sun. And the theoretical upper limit for sort of solar panels used today is about 33%. There is a huge disparity. And also, photosynthesis and plants in general have a huge water requirement as well, and only 5% efficiency with regards to water use. So if biofuel crops require artificial irrigation, this rapidly becomes very unsustainable, especially when you compare the sort of water wastage, which is the next point here. So yeah, the next problem with biofuels is that they are wasteful. So the first problem is water wastage, which we're just talking about. Biofuels use 240 times more water than solar energy and 72 times more water than fossil fuels. It's just kind of ridiculous that even fossil fuels have a lower water footprint. They're also a waste of farmland, destroying ecosystem. Most new farmland is used to grow corn. So when we're sort of expanding from the current farmland in the US to sort of maybe stuff that used to be rangelands or grasslands, and we're just turning this into sort of farmland, most of that new farmland is used to grow corn. And it has been shown that the price of corn has risen due to this huge demand for biofuels. And this drives up prices for the average consumer for things such as milk and wheat. No, not milk and meat, which are fed on corn. Meat, yeah, not wheat. Wheat is not fed on corn. And another problem that came to light is that an EU initiative to use more biofuels. So I'm usually I praise the EU generally, but their biofuel initiative turned out to be using a huge amount of unsustainable palm oil to feed the yeast to make the bioethanol rather than sort of corn crops, which, go back to episode 14, I'm sure you could understand is a problem. The next problem is it's actually quite polluting at times. So at this point, we've been talking mainly about bioethanol, but that's not the only biofuel. Another classic biofuel is just wood. Particularly wood-burning stoves. The idea, as we've discussed, is that wood is supposed to be a biofuel because trees capture carbon dioxide and then you burn it and it's sort of a cycle. And these sort of wood-burning stoves are highly popular in modern interior design on the grounds that they look nice and are very efficient. Admittedly, this is essentially true since open fires are about 20% efficient, wood stoves about 80%, but you don't really need a fire in the first place. I mean, we, in UK November, only just turned our heaters on, and it's quite common in sort of Victorian Edwardian English houses to have fireplaces blocked up anyway, but bit of tangent, but wood-burning stoves are not necessarily carbon neutral because they're quite polluting. They release large amounts of particulate matter. So actually, there's been a ban in the UK on wood stove fuel purchases. So we have a pizza oven, wood-fired pizza oven. We use sort of eco-friendly wood. We only use it about once a week. And in Malawi, we'd fire our pizza oven with wood from a tree that fell over. It actually destroyed the windscreen of our car. Funny story. And there's sort of these... do you remember... you're still there. Do you know the sort of black seed pods? The sort of long seed pods?
Yeah. Those are really good with
we
fire.
would just burn those. And
yeah, those are good.
yeah, there's no transport footprint for that, which could potentially have the increased carbon footprint of bioethanol. And we sort of knew the entire supply chain for the seed pods. Charcoal is another example of a widely used polluting biofuel. It is ultimately sort of just wood. And it doesn't need to be removed completely, but it should be regarded as a treat for a couple times a year at most. You should investigate briquettes, other sort of more eco-friendly grilling options. And also from a health perspective, meats grilled over barbecue tend to have harmful substances on them, such as and including carcinogens from the burning. So maybe just, make some stuff on the hob instead. Natural gas is quite a clean burning fuel comparatively. I think it generally just releases sort of carbon dioxide, not really any soot or anything. And obviously the sort of biofuels that we're generally talking about in this episode, the sort of bioethanol, petrol sort of lookalikes, they do emit nitrous oxides like normal fossil fuels, which are a problem, sort of about 300 times more GWP, I think, if I remember correctly. You sure you want to take the purely product of the corn industry?
I would like to take that point, but I would also like to kind of add here. So what you've been saying about wood-burning stoves and charcoal stoves is very true, and I 100% agree, especially in the Western world, especially for those who can afford better alternatives. These points are 100% applicable. But in a place like Malawi, so this is exactly kind of what my dad's working on right now, in a place like Malawi where, where like 1% of the population has energy, it's just about 1%. That's only in urban areas, and people rely on wood for their as fuel to be able to cook. They're deforesting large portions of the native Miambo woodland to be able to provide for their families to be able to cook. And so in a place like Malawi, for people in kind of the developing world, charcoal is actually quite a good solution if it's sustainably sourced. So one thing that's happening is more accessible, sustainably sourced charcoal is kind of circulating throughout Malawi rather than the illegal stuff. And my dad's project and a couple other projects are promoting these improved charcoal cook stoves and improved wood cook stoves for the locals here, because they're just more energy efficient. Like, you burn less, you get more kind of out of it, and then you're able to cook off less. So you're able to preserve more. So you have to use less charcoal, which means less money per meal you're spending on your fuel, and you're burning less per meal, which also means less emissions per meal. And so although this is very true, and I assume for a lot of listeners this is the case, and this is stuff you should be focusing on, in a place like Malawi where it's just third world country, developing nation, it's not always feasible to tell people to stop using firewood and charcoal, and rather we have to look at ways to make that kind of more sustainable and come up with better alternatives.
This is a general sort of thing as well with energy and renewable in sort of developing countries, is that we've had a chance to industrialize using fossil fuels, but now we're trying to tell these developing countries to industrialize without fossil fuels, and we've got to try and sort of find a way for them to still be able to have their economic development in a more environmentally friendly way. So, for example, we'll talk about in episode 18 about using natural gas rather than coal as sort of a bridge fuel towards renewables. And I think sort of these sort of more sustainable wood fire stoves in Malawi and sub-Saharan Africa are a good example. I do remember when I was in Malawi, there was sort of focus on briquettes, which are more sustainable than chopping down wood, especially when there's a big problem with deforestation. And I think the problem with wood burning stoves in the Western world is that they are really just for vanity. No one actually wants to use them for heating, really. So they don't really serve a purpose. And that's something we do want to try and avoid. Like, it's okay. Like, I was at a talk about sort of animal welfare and loving animals sort of stuff yesterday. It was like, maybe we could defend industrialized meat industry if it was necessary for our survival, but it is absolutely not necessary for our survival. So that makes it much harder to justify. The next problem with biofuels is that it's just a product of the corn industry. Maize shortages in Mexico were brought about by this sort of corn being channeled for biofuel use instead of human consumption. And generally, these sort of biofuel in normal fuels is pushed by pro-corn lobby groups for the farmers' interests. And I do not want to blame American farmers at all, because they are generally, their hand is forced by these big GMO and fertilizer and pest companies that enforce a broken system. So it's not at all the farmer's fault necessarily, but it is the problem of this generally. The interest is in the wrong place. The interest is not environmental, but it's for the big corn companies to get more money. It's not actually good for the environment. It is just another fossil fuel or plastic industry that's trying to manipulate consumer perception for their own good. And I don't think that's a good thing at all. And I think they're perfectly aware of its problems.
And I'd say that again, corn is probably one of the most unsustainable vegetables, because corn is most often grown with the practice of tillage, which is a hugely detrimental practice to soil biomes. And moreover, I'm assuming that the large majority of these corns being used for biofuels are GMO, which we've discussed in previous episodes as being a huge problem. I'm assuming that a lot of these are grown with pesticides, are grown with fertilizers, and these are all things that are hugely detrimental to the soil microbiomes and hugely detrimental to the surrounding ecosystems. And so kind of an unsustainable practice in our sourcing of the corn for biofuels makes it that much more inefficient. And we have food security. It's a worldwide problem. It's not just a problem in the developing world, it's a problem in the developed world, even though it's less noticeable. And the fact that we are unsustainably sourcing kind of food products, and then not even using it to address our food crisis is kind of silly. And then we're labeling it as the sustainable alternative to petrol and diesel. At the point at which you've used pesticides, fertilizers, GMOs, you've used tillage, you've shipped it halfway across the world, you've gone through the process of using the yeast to produce the ethanol, you've mixed it with the fuel, and then you've put it into someone's car, and that's being burned off. You've actually ended up probably putting off just as much emissions as you have using petrol. It's kind of ridiculous.
It is like the fossil fuel industry, and you can understand that the fossil fuel industry are keen to push biofuels as a way for them, and sort of the automotive industry as well, to continue with their internal combustion engines and their fossil fuels, and just knowingly pushing biofuels as a supposedly sustainable alternative. It just doesn't make any sense. Here's a quote from Real Engineering. "Growing plants for food is a necessity. Growing food for power is completely and utterly irrational. If we could eat electricity, we would, because it is just far more efficient to get get energy from electricity, from solar, from wind, than from plants, because it's just plants are just so inefficient compared to these sort of chemical solutions and physical solutions we've been able to manufacture. So it just makes zero sense to, as I would like the way you put it, to grow food for power. We can't, and also it's very difficult. Like if you saw that just to make 20% of the USA's petrol to be biofuels would take up almost 20% of their farmland. We can't feasibly make enough biofuels to decarbonize all of the fossil fuels that we use in transport. So biofuels and e-fuels should only be used where absolutely necessary and where electrification is just not possible. We should try and electrify as far as possible. So I'm currently recording this with my phone microphone. Hisho is, Sandhya is. And something that we'd all really like to do is to be able to use proper microphones for these podcasts. But we don't really have the money to do this at the moment. And if you could support us on Patreon, you just give a small amount every month, and in return we'll give you some exclusive episodes and extra stuff. That would be hugely appreciated. So if you have the money, please consider supporting us. If you don't, maybe say you're like our age and you don't really get that much money, don't feel obliged to give your savings to us, because we sort of understand that. And I don't think I support any other creators on Patreon. But if you have sort of more money and you support what we do, we would really appreciate it. Then we'll be able to get microphones and spread the climate love. Usually with these sort of episodes, we have problems and solutions, but alas, we have problematic solutions and solutions. So, the problematic solutions. There are plenty of alternatives to corn-based bioethanol, but they all have their own problems. The first of which is sugarcane ethanol. And although it is energy positive, so you do get more energy out than you put in to produce it, it is destroying Brazilian rainforests. And Brazil, as we all know, has the Amazon rainforest, which, as we all know, is like a big carbon sink and everything. So it might be energy positive on paper. The amount of carbon sort of sinkage or sequestration that we're losing by destroying rainforests to grow sugarcane for this is understandably a massive issue. And it's also imported overseas to the USA, an example of what we'll talk about in the future, renewable imperialism.
Actually, something crazy, which I think Tehran mentioned in a prior episode, and something which maybe I've mentioned in a previous episode. Tehran was an understudy, was featured in a previous episode in the last season. Listen to the episode, they did a great job. But the Amazon rainforest is actually now emitting more CO2 than it sequesters, and I think it's because we've broken it down so much for agriculture, for larger industries, for urban expansion, which is going to be section 2 of this season. And it's at the point now where there's so much from the rot of the natural rot, which occurs from like the dying undergrowth, from the cutting down of the trees, the burning of the trees. We're actually at the point now where the Amazon rainforest is emitting more greenhouse gases than it is sequestering, and that's very sad to think about. It's only going to get worse as we continue to destroy the rainforest, and we should be trying to reforest the Amazon right now, but in fact we're making it worse with our agricultural practices, and the fact that is being used for fuel as well as food means that you need more land to support that industry, and therefore deforestation is kind of booming in the Amazon region, considering how ideal it is for the growth of a lot of tropical plants and corn and the raising of cattle, etc.
That's a really interesting point, and I suppose it maybe potentially this sort of sugarcane ethanol is an example of those sort of things that are contributing to the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, and therefore its production of more CO2 than it emits.
I forgot to mention, kind of looking back at more what Sandhya did than what I did, I was thinking very kind of agriculture and emissions based, but the conservation and preservation of the ecosystems in the Amazon. I mean, I was thinking about kind of the emissions we're putting out, but think of all the species which we're killing. I mean, amphibians, arachnids, we have these hugely diverse ecosystems, and we're destroying them through this expansion in agriculture and urban areas, and the way that that's encroaching on the surrounding environments like the Amazon rainforest. And so we're losing animals on a daily basis. Large animals, small animals, animals you've probably never heard of, kind of little pieces to microbiomes, and they're going extinct every day. I mean, and it's crazy how much we're losing kind of due to our indirect actions in places like the Amazon.
And just to add to that, Hisho, I think there's a statistic somewhere about like scientists discover a certain amount of new species every year, and a large majority of them are from the Amazon rainforest, and we're just losing like all that discovery and like destroying these species habitats before we even have knowledge of them.
So the next problematic solution is cellulosic ethanol, made using grasses which are abundant and energy efficient. Alas, it is very energy intensive and expensive. The next sort of problematic solution, potentially the one that's most promising, is algae. So it's quite promising for a large number of reasons. It's widely available, reproduces quickly, you can use waste or salt water, very efficient photosynthesis. And algae actually does account for about 40% of carbon sequestration worldwide. But at its current sort of state, it is unsustainable and unprofitable. But with a large amount of research and development, it could become more promising. So another thing that algae can do is produce bio-crude oil, which has a very high energy density, which is useful for some specific applications as well. The next problematic solution is waste cooking oil. So oils, such as controversially palm oil, can be used as a feedstock for biofuels. And so one idea that you might think of is like, just use waste cooking oil. And it seems genius, but practicalities can get in the way. We'd need an entirely new supply chain and infrastructure to build a sort of waste cooking oil recycling system. And there's just little incentive for people to collect. It's a bit difficult, it's a waste of time. You need a lot of it as well. And waste cooking oils would likely require purification as well before they could use as a generally clean burning fuel, hence increasing the inefficiency of these biofuels. The next problematic solution is aviation fuels. And the problem is that biofuels seem like a solution to aviation. They have very complicated needs, or aviation fuels have very complicated needs. They need to have a high flash point so that, like, for example, rubber tires getting very hot upon landing doesn't ignite the fuel tanks. They need to have low freezing point because especially even above equatorial regions, the air, thousands of feet up in the air, is very cold.
I apologize for my use of imperial units.
And although the sort of actual jet engines can accept just about anything that's liquid and burns, the jet engines aren't fussy. But for them to work in a flying plane that's safe, there are far more specific requirements. And the last problematic solution is e-fuels. I mentioned these in the introduction. Technically carbon neutral if produced with renewable energy, but of course you need to have renewable hydrogen as well. So the thing is, and also this could be a waste of hydrogen that could be used directly as a fuel. E-fuels cannot be both low cost and low carbon at current electricity prices. They could be low cost if you used coal energy and methane-based hydrogen, or they could be low carbon, but they cannot be both at the same time. So here's a shocking statistic. They are only 16% efficient from the starting electricity to the moving car, compared to a normal EV is 72% efficient from the electricity. So this doesn't account for the inefficiency of solar panels, for example. Any points on those? I know it's a bit technical.
I like what you said about the algae. That was something that I was really interested in when I was looking over the show notes earlier.
Yeah, I think it is quite promising.
I think, like, just if we try to focus on the areas that are already, even, like, without human intervention, that are already looking promising, we can improve them to some extent. I hope human intervention doesn't ruin them, though.
Yeah, let's hope that science can prevail. The first solution is, drumroll, guys,
electricity.
Electricity is far more efficient because you can directly use the electricity to power a car or anything that turns can be powered with electricity. Consumes far less space for the output. I think this is sort of in terms of land area. You can produce much more electricity with a small solar farm or especially a small nuclear plant compared to a huge amount of corn crop. Easy to transport. You don't need to use pipelines for biogas or big tankers for bio oil. And it's just far more easier to transport electricity because you just need high voltage AC or DC cables over long distances and just generic copper wires over short distances. The only slight disadvantage, of course, of electricity in this regard is it's somewhat harder to store in the long term. Batteries self-discharge and have a higher cost per kilowatt hour, particularly relevant for emergency energy usage in generators or lanterns in remote locations. But I think it's better to use electricity to generate hydrogen rather than trying to use biofuels for this, because it's easier to sort of store hydrogen. But anyway, this sort of grid storage stuff will be mentioned in episode 18. The next solution is to continue research in algae and other biofuels. There are some applications of fossil fuels currently that are extremely difficult to decarbonize, especially planes, using electricity because of the sort of weight of batteries that we talked about in the transportation section way back. And having decent biofuels available would allow us to decarbonize everything rather than getting maybe 90% of the way of there with electricity. But it should be noted that electricity comes first and foremost before we consider biofuels in any specific application. Next solution is hydrogen. We talked about this in depth in episode 4. This is sort of the first part of the process of making e-fuels, is to make green hydrogen to then combine with carbon dioxide. But instead of doing this, you could just use that hydrogen as a fuel itself. So there are currently some hydrogen cars made by Toyota which run using a hydrogen fuel cell, which is an awesome piece of technology that just emits water, which is not a greenhouse gas.
Well, technically, water vapor can be a greenhouse gas when it's emitted high up in the atmosphere from the contrails of an aircraft, but I digress. That's not so important to hydrogen fuel cell vehicles.
Here's something that I think is very important, and I think something that I personally think is the way forward, is government intervention. In general, I think there needs to be a crackdown on this sort of fossil fuel, plastic, corn industry lobbying, because the sort of small scale organic farmers or whatever the equivalent is in plastic industry or fossil fuel industry don't really have a say when these huge companies have millions and bajillions of dollars to spend basically changing the laws of a country to make themselves even more money. You can understand there isn't really a break point there. So activism is a great way to do this, like write to your local politician to check that they're not, accepting lobbying money from big corporations. And basically we want the government to focus on investment in things that actually work, like electric cars and better batteries and grid transmission infrastructure we'll talk about in the future. So I think government intervention is something that we really need and something that we're not seeing really now, other than, problematic biofuel legislation.
And again, like, government intervention can come in the form of not only like regulation and law enforcement, but you can also find government intervention in the form of incentives, which is something we've talked a lot about in the past. So incentivizing more sustainable fuel alternatives, possibly with tax reductions, etc., can be hugely successful in kind of moving the general public in the correct direction.
Okay, so the last solution is maybe not a good idea to end on it, because it's not a big solution, but aluminium air batteries. And this probably would have fit better in the transportation section, but I thought I'd pop it in here because I only recently found out about it. But aluminium air batteries are a type of battery that's quite interesting. It's made from aluminium, which is very easy to recycle, and that's one of the advantages. Aluminium air batteries cannot be recharged, however. So the idea is that if you use them in ships, they can last for a long time. So they have quite a long range for the battery. And then once you get to a port, there'd be, a new aluminium air battery waiting for you, and then you recycle the old one. So using them in EVs would be quite difficult because you'd need to have like replacements everywhere. But if you use them in ships, they're about the size of a standard shipping container to be able to provide a huge amount of power over a long time. So that's aluminium air batteries, something to maybe look into. Again, this sort of ties into government investment and continuing research and development in more sustainable things. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out through the usual channels, join our Discord server, private message on Patreon, Instagram DMs, Twitter DMs, email, links in the description. The sources are in the show notes. There's a Notion document, which is a website you can access, and that'll have all the links, further reading, if you want to fact check this sort of stuff. Anything else you guys want to add?
Nope.
Great. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
See you later.
Thank you. Bye.